QSO Today, episode 232, George Zafiropoulos KJ6VU. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers for every level of amateur radio operator. Visit ICOM at www.icomamerica.com/amateur to find your rig for the new year. And by QRP Labs, makers of the QCX single-band transceiver kit and a host of other QRP radio kits and parts for the Ham Radio Builder. Click on the link to QRP Labs in this week's show notes page. Please support the QSO Today podcast by supporting these fine sponsors. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, 4Z1UG, your host. Like many of you, I listen to a lot of podcasts every week. I post a list of mine on the QSO Today website under podcast menu item. My weekly selections include different subjects, including amateur radio. And one of my favorite ham radio podcasts is the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, hosted by George KJ6VU and Jeremy KF7IJZ. George and Jeremy have created a large following by discussing the projects on their workbench and creating build projects that their community can do together. So if you've listened to the QSO Today podcast for a while, you know that I love to tinker and build. So getting George Zafiropoulos KJ6VU to spend an hour with me on QSO Today to talk about his ham radio story and interest was easy and fun. So it is my pleasure to bring you this QSO Today with KJ6VU. KJ6VU, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, George?
4Z1UG, KJ6VU. Hello, Eric. How are you?
I'm great, George. Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Sure. I think I was always interested in radio, but didn't really know what that meant exactly when I was a kid. But in middle school, in junior high school, a friend of mine came to school one day, and he brought these postcards to show us at school. They were QSL cards from shortwave broadcast stations. So he was telling us about how he was listening to these shortwave broadcasters like Radio Netherlands and the BBC and Deutsche Welle and these kind of stations, and that really piqued my curiosity. And so he had gotten a receiver for Christmas. It was a Drake 2B of all things, the venerable receiver, very famous, and that got me interested in radio. And I got my parents to buy a realistic shortwave receiver from Radio Shack. So that was my first receiver, and I started doing the same thing. So I would tune into international shortwave broadcasters and try to get QSL cards and letters and such from them. So that's how I first got introduced to radio. And of course, when you start with shortwave broadcasting, it doesn't take too long to find the amateur radio bands. And my receiver had a BFO, so I could decode the single sideband signals, and that's how I found ham radio at about age 11 or 12.
I see. Where was the hometown?
That was Los Angeles, California. Yeah, grew up in West Los Angeles and went to school in West LA, and middle school was where all that started.
Did you have a ham radio mentor or Elmer that kind of moved you from being a shortwave listener to a ham radio operator?
Oh, well, moving from shortwave to ham radio was really something that my friend Tony and I kind of discovered on our own. But once we got interested in that, there were a lot of mentors. And at our junior high school, the guy who I'll never forget was our boys' vice principal, and his name was Gene Midyett. And he was a really tall, really big guy. So, the boys' vice principal, their main job at that time was to keep order, as I recall.
Right, they had a big paddle. That was that was when corporal punishment was still okay in the schools.
They had the big paddle on the wall, and it said "ouch" on it. Literally, never forget that in his office. So the main thing you wanted to do while you're in junior high school is stay out of his office. So I was sitting in the library, and I was reading over a copy of the ARRL handbook, like you do, sitting in the library as a nerd. And along comes Mr. Midyett, and he stood in front of me while I'm flipping through the book. And he looks down, and in this big booming voice, he says, "Are you a ham?" And I looked up, like afraid to talk to this guy. And I said, "No, but I'm interested in being one." He said, "Come to my office." So, all right. So off we go to Mr. Midyet's office, which is, that never ends well for normal people, but I figured this is probably okay. So we get to his office, and he said that he's a ham and that he would be interested in helping other students get their license. And so I went back and talked to my friend Tony, who is the guy who got me started on all this to begin with. And we put together a little group of guys to take an after-school class with Mr. Midyet. And so he walked through the whole novice material, including code practice. And we went off and got our novice licenses. So he was just amazing. And one other little side story, after I kind of got to know him a little bit, I remember one time sitting in my English class, and when bad things happen, they would send a hall monitor to your class with a summons. And so the hall monitor comes in and hands a slip of piece of paper to the teacher, and of course everybody's eyes are riveted on the teacher, like, okay, who's busted now?
Right, grave look on the teacher's face, right?
Exactly. So the teacher looks over to me and says, Mr. Midyet's office, and everybody in the classroom is like, ooh, so nothing good happens. So I, head up to the office. And of course, at this point, I know that, this is okay, right? So I get up there, and he hands me a big shopping bag full of QST magazines. And that was like the best thing ever. These were all QSTs from the 50s and 60s. And there must have been, 40, 50 copies in there. And he said, here, these are for you. And I think I devoured every one of those things.
Do you remember your first call sign, George?
Yeah, my novice call sign was Whiskey November 6 Charlie Mike Mike in 1972.
How long were you a novice?
Oh, gosh, I was a novice for the full 2 years. So it ran for 2 years, then expired. And so I rode that thing all the way out. And after it expired, then I worked on getting my technician license. And my friend Tony and I both got our technicians at the same time, because we had sequential calls. So my call as a tech was Whiskey Alpha 6 Yankee Papa Sierra, which is another call sign I was never really thrilled with. But
well, it's not bad for voice technician.
Yeah, but it was awful for CW, so it was just not a good call. So yeah, technician, and then over time I eventually wound up doing the general and the advanced, and then eventually extra. But it took years. I kind of spent time in every license class, not really on purpose, but just took time to deal with all the other things going on in life, and eventually get to the next license class.
How important was your novice license to you in terms of finding your place in ham radio?
Oh, it was amazingly important to me. So it was very important in terms of ham radio, but I think it was really more important just in life in general, because I think I was always interested in electronics, and the amateur radio license gave me that opportunity to learn about electronics. There's an application for it, and not just learning about things hypothetically. So it really gave me a reason to learn about how things worked. And so because of that, I got to build all kinds of stuff and try to understand how things work. And so it was very important to me.
What was your first rig?
Oh, gosh. Well, the very, very first rig was that realistic DX150, which was by all measures a pretty lousy shortwave receiver. But I had that, and then there was a bunch of hams in the neighborhood, and one of them loaned me a Johnson Viking Ranger. And the Viking Ranger was this very heavy, big, old transmitter that did about 75 or 90 watts CW on the HF bands. And it was old when I got it. So, this is back in the early
50s,
70s. Yeah, it's from the 50s. And the thing was built like a tank. And actually, the receiver was so awful, you had no idea what frequency you were on, because it just had this slide rule tuning dial. So the first thing I ever built was a crystal oscillator. There's an article in QST magazine, I think in 72, for this little oscillator circuit, and you would get a 40-meter crystal, and it would generate a carrier on that frequency. And so I had a crystal on 7.111 megahertz, kind of in the middle of the novice band. And I would turn that thing on, and then I could at least figure out where that frequency was. and I could move off of that a little bit and not be out of the novice band. So that was the first radio. And then after about a year or so, my dad, for a Christmas present, bought me a used Drake R4B, which was like the best thing ever. So that was a phenomenal receiver. I mean, that was a really good radio, and you could buy a used radio, they're not too expensive. And he had no idea what that was or what we should be looking for. So we went down to the local ham radio store and got a lot of help down there. And then that's what he bought for me. So that was great.
And the local ham radio store was?
Oh gosh, Henry Radio.
Yeah.
Yeah. Henry Radio was just an amazing place with a wonderful group of people there. And I can tell you all kinds of stories about Henry Radio, but that was just an incredible place for a kid to go and look at all the gear.
That was my store in Anaheim, but your store was up in West LA.
That's right.
Right. Yeah. What a place that was.
Yeah. In fact, I'll never ever forget the guy who sold us the radio was a fellow named Frank Cuevas, and Frank was W6AOA. And he was a big-time DXer. He worked for Rockwell Collins and then retired and went to work, I think, because he had nothing else better to do. So he went to work, as a lot of guys did, at Henry Radio. And he was just a bigger-than-life kind of character. And Frank was one of these guys who, when you first meet him, you think, man, this is a gruff dude, like he doesn't tolerate any kids or, anybody wasting his time. He was like a, tough guy. And for some reason, Frank took a liking to me, and he sold us the radio. And then, I don't know, some months later, I was about 15 and wanted to get a job anywhere. And so I mentioned that to Frank at Henry Radio, and he said, "Come with me." And he sort of dragged me into the back of the store and introduced me to Ted Henry, who is the owner. And actually the Ted Henry Jr., the owner's son, and who was running the store. And he said, "Ted, hire this kid." So Ted was like, okay. And so I got my first job working at Henry Radio because of Frank.
And what'd you do there?
Oh, I spent about 5 years there. Probably the first 3 years, 2-3 years, worked on the sales counter, selling radios and antennas and coax.
The dream job.
All that stuff. Oh, it was like, I honestly, Eric, I told Frank, I said, if you let me come here and do this, I'd do this for free. Now, at the time, it was almost for free because we made $2.15 an hour.
Right. I remember those days.
It was pretty low pay, but it was like dying and going to heaven because you got to play with all this gear. You got to meet all these people. The best part about it, and this is just a phenomenal experience, people would come in and say, okay, I want a radio to do this. What should I buy? And of course, at first you have no idea. And so the old timers there would give them advice, and you'd sit there and listen and take it all in. And, eventually you knew enough to help people pick out radios and antennas and what's the difference between this coax and that coax. And it was just a phenomenal learning experience.
So Henry Radio was your radio school.
It was. Oh, absolutely. And in the last couple of years I worked there, I worked in the service department. So we would do everything from setting up handy talkies, which at the time, you remember way back when, they were all crystal controlled. So guys would buy radios. Tempo was our brand. And we would, put crystals in them and tune them up. And then if some radio came in that was not working right, like an HF radio or even a handy talkie, then would have to figure out what's wrong with it and try to fix it. And that was an amazing experience because I really learned a ton of practical experience of how to use test equipment. It's, service monitors and, how to set the deviation on FM transmitter, how to net the crystals, how to align a receiver, just all this basic stuff. And actually get paid to do it. It was, like you said, it really was a dream job. It was great. And the people were wonderful. I mean, it was just a fantastic place.
How important were ham radio clubs then in your early ham radio career?
I think ham clubs, I never really had like a general ham club that I belonged to. I think
there were a lot in West LA in those days.
Oh, yes.
Right, Palisades.
Yes. Oh, there are tons. Park. There were a lot. I got involved with the Races group for LA, which is sponsored by the LA County Sheriff's Office, and did some stuff with them, like the Rose Parade and things like that. So that's the closest I got to like normal clubs. But I always had a lot of friends who are hams because, you make friends at work, right? So you get to know the guys. And so at Henry Radio, all the people there were either kids in school or retired guys, and like almost nobody in between. And so a lot of the younger guys got to know each other, and, we all became good friends and would, hang out on the weekend or, do some radio activity or just, goof around or whatever you do when you're a teenager. So a lot of my friends were hams, and we ultimately wound up building repeaters and stuff like that. So, we kind of made our own club.
As I remember those days, I was also in the Los Angeles area at the time. And now this message from ICOM America, makers of the finest amateur radio transceivers for every level of amateur radio operator. Calling all hams. ICOM knows that amateur radio is all about community and wants to give back to the amateur radio community that has been loyal to it for over 50 years. To this end, ICOM has launched 2 initiatives. The first, ICOM has launched a promotion exclusively to ham radio clubs. By registering your ham radio club, your club could win an ICOM radio, ICOM swag, a live presentation on Skype, or a live in-person presentation by an ICOM rep at your ham radio club meeting. Secondly, according to the ARRL website, there are over 195 conventions and ham fests scheduled in the United States in 2019. ICOM knows that hamfests play a big role in to bring hams together to learn from their peers and radio industry leaders. ICOM has launched a promotion exclusively for hamfests. Register your hamfest today, and your hamfest could win an ICOM swag, a forum presentation, or an ICOM booth set up at your hamfest. For more information and to register your club or hamfest, click on the ICOM image in this week's show notes page. You can also search on Twitter and the Internet using hashtag ICOM Everywhere, one word, that's hashtag ICOM Everywhere, or go to icomamerica.com/amateur to register your club or hamfest. My thanks to ICOM America for being such a wonderful sponsor of the QSO Today podcast. Please be sure to tell your dealer on your next ICOM purchase that you heard it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO Today. You say you built repeaters. Where'd you build them and where'd you put them?
The first repeater I ever built was with a fellow named Bob, KJ6VU. So Bob lived in my neighborhood, and we kind of got to know each other from him coming into the store. And at that time, 220 was starting to take off. And there was a radio that was very popular called a Midland 13509. And it was a 12-channel crystal-controlled mobile radio. And I don't remember the details, but I think Midland made a bunch of these radios because they were hoping that they would be used for some commercial application or I don't know what. But anyway, they wound up bombing the price and blowing them out for like $100. And so you can get a 220 radio cheap. So the beauty of the Midland radio was you could break it apart. So if you took the cover off, the receive and the transmit circuit boards were 2 different boards, and the PA was the third module. So you could disassemble the radio, and you had a radio that could be a full duplex repeater. So there's no two-meter and UHF channels. Yeah, for $100. So some metal work in a duplexer and an antenna, and you're on the air. So Bob and I built a 220 repeater, and we put it at his house in West Los Angeles on a little hill. And so, in the neighborhood, it had some coverage. And at the same time, 2 other guys who I knew through the store were doing exactly the same thing. Jeff, WA6EQU, and Tony, WA6DCJ. Those 2 guys got together, and they were building a 220 repeater. And so just by happenstance, we were talking one day and realized that the 4 of us were kind of doing the same thing. And we said, well, why don't we do this together? So we formed a little club and put up our first 220 repeater on Saddle Peak, which covered West Los Angeles and the coastline quite well. So that was back probably in about 1976, something like that. Mm-hmm. So that was the first repeater, and eventually that system grew to 4 or 5 other sites linked together, and Jeff was very active with the Cactus Intertie, which you're familiar with. So we got to be good friends, and he introduced me to Cactus, and then eventually joined Cactus. And the Cactus Intertie is, for the listeners, a network of RF link repeaters that covers the whole southwestern United States. And there's today over 200 repeaters all connected together, 90% of which is all RF full duplex connections. So it's an absolutely amazing system. And that was a whole nother group of Elmers and, smarter guys you'd never want to meet. I mean, these guys knew their stuff because they were all professional two-way radio guys and broadcast engineers and really knew RF, really knew radio. And that was a great training ground also.
And with Cactus, the audio quality was key.
Yes, that's right.
No matter what.
So that's right. And, a lot of times people will slap two radios together and make a repeater and it sounds crappy. But the Cactus guys were super finicky. So not only did the repeater sound good, but to make it more complicated, when you're linking multiple sites down a path where you have site A linked to site B to C to D to E to F, you can go down a dozen hops. And what are the odds that the audio sounds any good at the end of that path? And pretty low, unless you are paying excruciating attention to the details, and they did. And the audio sounded remarkably good. So yeah, audio was really good. The system reliability, it was really not built like an amateur or anything. It was really built like a commercial two-way installation by people who love doing it. So, you kind of had that professional approach plus, really that personal desire to make it right. And so that's why they did such a great job.
Yeah, their original control systems were built by or designed by Alan Bergstaller.
Yes, I think it was WA6AWD. And
so those were like 4 vector card cages, 22 cards each, stacked up.
Yes, pretty close. In fact, there are 3U size. So Alan, so kind of taking a step back, the very first link that Cactus put in, this is a little bit before my time there, they put in a repeater on Sunset Ridge in Los Angeles, and then another repeater on Santa Ynez up near Santa Barbara. And so there are 2 UHF repeaters and a 420 full duplex link between the two. So the reason why, by the way,
I hate to correct you. It went through Saddle Peak.
Oh, did it go through Saddle Peak?
I don't think there was a direct path. I was actually around in those days when those first links went in.
Yeah, so that would make sense because it's right, halfway in between. Yeah, that would make sense. So Alan designed the controller to make all this stuff work, and he was really brilliant. He came up with this control. I hate to use the word paradigm for anything, right, but paradigm, which essentially let you control the repeater with touch tones locally, or send control codes down the link and remotely control a remote site. So you can go into one repeater and control any of the repeaters, and the control codes were all consistent, but there's an addressing scheme that made all that work. So like you're saying, that the whole thing was built out of these homemade circuit boards that plugged into a vector card cage. And Alan laid out, designed the circuit, laid out the board manually. This is in the era where you would have a piece of right, plastic, and you'd lay down the black tape and then photo expose the circuit board and then etch it. And then drill your own holes. And the way we made through-hole vias was to put a piece of bus wire through the board and solder both sides of it, because, of course, we had no way to plate the stuff. So anyway, Alan designed this phenomenal control system. And at the back of the card cage, all of the connectors were all point-to-point hand-wired. And in fact, the way you would do a sequence decode, like touchtone 1, 2, 3, there would be DTMF decoders, the outputs of which would go to the inputs of gates and flip-flops, and it would look for the pulse of each of those 3 digits going low in the right sequence. And once the flip-flops were set properly, then it would latch an output. And there's timers to reset it. And so all this stuff was done in hardware, and it was just amazing. And so he designed all that stuff, and I got to build one. So this was probably around 1977. I'm in high school, and So we're going to build our own repeater controller for our repeater. And so I bought a set of cards from Alan. And when I say bought a set, I mean literally a set of circuit boards. And then we had to build them all and wire point to point the back plane and then get the thing to work. And it worked. And it was super reliable. And he just did a masterful job of designing this thing.
Yeah, and you remember his DTMF decoder was 88 millihenry toroids.
Mm-hmm.
And his CW idea was also an oscillator made with 88 millihenry toroids.
Yeah. And the funny thing is, like in that era, the tone decoders, typically people were using these 567 phase lock loop chips, which is what the phone company used. And you know, that would work okay on a very low noise channel, but in a mobile, that wasn't really very good. So Alan designed those tone decoders with these high Q notch filters for each of the tones. And man, that thing could decode a DTMF signal way the heck down in the noise, just unbelievably good. And I would say that the 8870 or 8880 DTMF chips today, you would certainly use those chips. You wouldn't go back and use these toroids because the size is like huge. But I would say that those toroid decoders were as good or better than these chips are even today. It was just amazing.
You know, I'm sitting here thinking as you're talking about this phase of your ham radio life, and also the fact that you were a novice for a while and then a technician for a while and then general. Were each of these, say, license levels, were these also opportunities for you to explore something different in ham radio?
That's a great observation, but it's really not the way it was planned. So in retrospect, I would say if you could constrain yourself to a certain set of options and then go deep in that set, then you can learn a lot about it and then move to the next. That would be a great way to think about it. But that's, of course, it's not really the reason that happened. The reason was just I was lazy. So I got the novice, and with a novice, you're on 15 and 40 meter CW, and that's it. Well, you had 4 bands you can operate, but I only had an antenna for 2 bands, and only one mode, CW. So I learned CW because that's all I could do. When I got my tech, I focused pretty much all of my energy on repeaters because that was the hot new thing. And it's VHF and up, and there really was nothing else you could do. So that was really kind of the only option, but it was a fascinating one at the time. And then when I got my general, then I wanted to do more HF operating, and I finally had a place where I could put up an antenna and all that. So I could really learn more about sideband and other HF operating techniques in addition to CW. So it sort of forced me to go deeper in each of those areas, but it's not by design. It was just by laziness. So okay, if at that time when you got your general, the technician and the general were the same written. The only difference was 5 versus 13 words a minute. And so I got my tech because I wasn't doing 13 words a minute. Otherwise, I would have had my general. And then I said, okay, at some point I really got to fix that and then get my general and then on from there.
Well, the reason I'm reflecting on this is because, it seems to me that with the way the licensing is now, that people can go from, DC to blue light in a single setting, a single sitting in front of VEs if they want to. And yet it seems like they miss the whole menu of ham radio. And at least, with the way the novice system worked, novice and work your way up, that while that wasn't your plan, it appears to me that you actually benefited from this kind of step-by-step process. What do you think?
I think that's absolutely true. Because if I started out, when I got my novice ticket, if I had started with a technician license, I would have never been a CW operator because CW takes effort. And, it's just easier to pick up a mic and talk. And so I probably never would have really gotten into CW. So in a way that the first couple of years as a novice was one of the best things that ever happened, because today I really like CW a lot, although I still find it challenging. But I think it's a great mode. And had I not had those first couple of years, like when I think about classes I took in school, the best class I probably ever took up through high school was typing. Today, being able to touch type is an incredibly useful skill. Who would have known, way back then that, typing was going to be essential to using computers every day. So, you never know. But so I think your point is a very valid one. In a way, the biggest problem with becoming a ham today is there's too much to do. And where do you start?
Right, and I think too many people are starting with the VHF, UHF portables. That's not to kind of diss them or dun them. It's just that they may think that that's all there is.
Yeah, I think that's a risk for sure. The way I look at it, the whole VHF, UHF repeater thing is kind of one world, and every HF kind of mode is a different world. And I think you really should do both. And to me, if I only had one to pick, even though I'm probably spending more time on VHF than HF in general, because I'm in the car and that's kind of when I get a chance to operate. But I really think HF is the core. I mean, that is even still today like the essence of amateur radio, the most pure part of it, if I would put it that way. But I see the whole VHF, UHF, repeater, and all that jazz as a way to supplement everything else. So it's a way to make regular, reliable contacts with friends and family, and it always works. Whereas on HF, it's much more the vagaries of the ionosphere and your skill set, and the time of day, and all those things that go into the magic of working HF. And so, I think they really go hand in hand. They're just two very different worlds.
Did ham radio play a part then in the choices that you made for your education and career?
Oh yeah, I think so. I think I was always interested in electronics, and even if I didn't become a ham, I probably would go into that field anyway. But I think it really solidified my interest and really helped me a ton, because I learned so many basic things through ham radio. Like the first thing I ever built, serious project I built, was a keyer. And it was an article in QST for, I think it was called an AccuKeyer. And it was a little, 4-inch circuit board with about 5 or 6 digital, TTL components and a bunch of discrete parts. And I learned what every single logic gate did and what each component did, because I assembled this thing and of course it didn't work. And then I figured out what the problem was, and I wanted to understand how the circuit behaved. And so that was my first hands-on introduction to digital electronics. And that's at such a basic level, but it introduced me to, the building blocks, the basics of how this stuff works. And so it helped me, I think, tremendously in understanding not only digital stuff, but analog and RF. And it's really made an enormous difference in my ability to try to kind of comprehend this stuff.
Well, you're as I understand, you have a degree in electronic engineering or something like that. Where did you go to school?
So I went to Cal State in Northridge, California. So Cal State, my school started out in computer science and computer engineering, and did that for some years, and then towards the end of that, I decided to go for a business degree, and I transferred to Pepperdine University and wound up getting my my degree in business. So I have kind of a weird hybrid of electrical engineering / business as a background.
And did you get an MBA as well?
No, I didn't get an MBA. I got what they called a BSM, which is essentially Pepperdine did an MBA and a bachelor's version of that. So it's the bachelor version of the MBA.
And what do you do now?
So I work for a test and measurement company called National Instruments, and they're
a small mom and pop shop.
Yeah, a small mom and pop shop, about 7,000 employees. So we do test and measurement equipment and control systems, and I work in their semiconductor area doing business development. So we make virtually every kind of test equipment that you can think of, and a whole software infrastructure to control and program it all.
And it's my understanding that this job has you on the road quite a bit?
Yeah, a fair bit. So I do a lot of work between our R&D teams and our customers. And so a lot of what I work on needs a lot of interaction with our users and our customers. So all our customers are concentrated in, of course, in the U.S., but also in Europe and in Asia.
That's really cool. Of course, because you work for National Instruments, you're now up in the Silicon Valley, right?
That's right, yeah.
And now this message from QRP Labs. QRP Labs has shipped thousands of QCX QRP transceivers kits to date. The odds of working another QCX user gets better every day. If you're looking for a satisfying kit experience where you end up with an amazing performing QRP transceiver for under $50, let me say that again, for under $50, then you owe it to yourself to go to QRP Labs. We have many home brewers who listen to the QSO Today podcast. For you, QRP Labs also has parts, filters, enclosures, and other handy devices to make your home brewing experience even better. You can use these parts to either enhance your QRP Labs kits or to beef up your own homebrew designs. Be sure to browse Hand's entire website. Use the link on this week's show notes page or the one in the sponsored section of the QSO Today website to get to QRP Labs to buy your QCX or any of the other fine QRP Labs kits or parts. QRP Labs is my go-to ham radio kit company. It should be yours too. QRP Labs. And now back to our QSO Today. You have a popular ham radio podcast called the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, along with co-host Jeremy KF7IJZ. It's my favorite, I must say. How did you get started?
Oh, boy. This goes back probably 4 years ago. So as you know, ham radio podcasting was sort of taking off. One of the shows I found early on was called the Photime Podcast, which was put out by Cale Nelson, K4CDN. And he started that show, and I listened to the first couple of episodes, and I thought, wow, this is really pretty good. And this guy's really quite charming, and he has good guests. And so I listened to that for a few episodes, and he was looking for guests, and I had sent him an email, and I said, I know a lot of guys who are pretty sharp on various ham radio topics, and here's a list of people and topics, and I could introduce you to these guys if you want to get them on the show. And so we got to talking, and he said, oh, well, a thing or two about repeaters. You want to do an episode on repeaters? And I said, okay, sure. That'd be great. I'd be honored to be on the show. So we did an episode. He asked me, all the basic questions about, what's a repeater, how does it work, and all that. And it was really fun, and I enjoyed it a lot, and Cale was a great guy. And so afterwards, I followed up, and I said, hey, this is really fun. I'd be happy to help you get guests for your show. And so then he invited me later on to come back on the show. And the funny thing was, in parallel with all this, somehow he met Jeremy. So Jeremy KF7IJZ, like you mentioned, was interested in similar things. And I think he had Jeremy on the show to do an interview. And somehow he connected the two of us together. And the funny thing was, I had seen a YouTube video that Jeremy did about solar panels and ham radio, where he compared these Goal Zero rigid solar panels to a PowerFilm Solar foldable solar panel, and he also did a build project to put a LiFePO4 battery and charge controller and all this stuff in a Pelican case. And when I saw his build project, I thought, if I knew all those parts existed, that's exactly what I would have built. That guy really got it right. And then Cale introduces us, and it turns out, hey, I saw your videos, and I'm a big fan. And he's like, oh, that's really awesome. And so we kind of, kicked off our friendship. And so we did a couple of episodes with Cale, and eventually, Cale suggested that we could do our own show, and which was really not the idea. I like the idea of helping him out and building content for the show. But the last thing I had in my mind was to host a podcast. But anyway, we got to talking, and Jeremy and I said, well, that would be fun. Let's try to do a show. And Jeremy said, okay, I'm in, but I can't imagine that we could do more than a handful of shows. I mean, let's not commit to anything. let's just do like 5 or 6 episodes as a special, special event interspersed with Cale's show. Okay, fine. So we did like 4 or 5 shows and realized man, we're not even scratching the surface on this thing. We could do this for more than a half a dozen shows. So we decided to make it a regular thing. And so Cale would put out a show. And at that time, once we started working together, we said, rebranding this would make more sense. So Cale changed the name of his show to Ham Radio 360. And then our show became the Ham Radio 360 Workbench, which is like a mouthful. But, we wanted to continue the brand identity of Ham Radio 360. So we did that. And every other week would be the other show. And then that was about 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago. And then about a year ago, Cale said, I'm going to stop doing Ham Radio 360. I've got a bunch of other things I want to do. It's been great, but I'm going to go do other stuff. So Jeremy and I thought, okay, well, I think we just need to go do our own thing. So we basically continued on with the production of our show every other week and put up our own website, our own feed, and all the stuff you got to do to put a podcast out. And so we've been basically doing it now for 2+ years, and independent of Cale's work for the last year plus. So that's kind of the origin.
I was going to say, not to rib you and Jeremy, and when you have nothing to talk about, you can always talk about DMR. But I'm just kidding. But how did the...
But only a little bit.
Well, I've learned a lot about DMR. I'm still on the fence in terms of whether I like it or not, or like it that much or not. But did it seem obvious to you guys? Because apparently what's happened in the evolution of your Workbench podcast is you've started to create your own build projects, and as a result of that, you create products out of those projects. Did it occur to you then at the beginning that you would end up having these products?
No, is the short answer. No, not at all. So, like I said, when we started out, we didn't even know we were going to do a podcast for more than a half dozen episodes. So, everything kind of goes in small steps, and you can discover what the opportunity is at every step. So we realized, well, if we have the energy, we could probably keep doing this show as long as people are willing to listen for a long time, because there's a limitless set of topics. And what we found was we got a lot of positive feedback from our listeners who really wanted to build stuff. And we like to build stuff, and that's kind of the theme of the show. So we thought, well, we can encourage people to go build kits, which we do, like Han Summers, QCX. We've been a big proponent of that. We've been a big proponent of getting a BitX, and putting stuff together and, melting some solder. Well, along the way, I've built a lot of projects over the years, and some of them seemed like they would be good for our listeners. And a friend of mine, Barrick KJ6VU, who's a professional RF designer, designed an antenna analyzer, and I helped him do a little bit of the board layout, but he designed the circuit, wrote the software, did 99% of the work. So I went to Barrick and I said, hey, that antenna analyzer is a very cool project. Why don't we make a bunch of circuit boards and sell them? And, that would be great. And he's like, sure, let's do that. By the way, rewind. This is back in the Ham Radio 360 era.
Right. I remember the project.
So I went to Cale and I said, hey, Cale, we got this design for an antenna analyzer. I think it'll be popular. And so here's the thing. Barrick designed it, and I can go make the raw circuit boards, but I don't really want to be in the circuit board distribution business. And I was thinking, Cale's got like 5 kids. So I said, this would be a great project for your kids if they want to, earn some money. So why don't we make the circuit boards, and you have your kids box them up and ship them out. And you can charge something for the service of doing that, which is what they did. And so the boards cost, the boards and the shipping and the envelope and everything cost, I don't know, $6. And then I think he sold them for like $10 or something like that. So the kids made $4 a board. And that was great because, the kids were working and got a little bit of pocket change, and we got these boards to our listeners, and we made 100 boards, sold them out. And we thought, well, I guess we can make some more. How many do you make? 50? I don't know. Who wants this thing? I don't know. Let's make another 100. Sold out. So by the end of that, we actually shipped like 750 boards.
Amazing.
And I'm sure most of them are sitting on a shelf somewhere. I don't know if people actually all built them all, but it was incredible. And so, we saw that and thought, well, if people really love that, maybe they'd like some other stuff. And so after Jeremy and I started doing Workbench on our own, then we thought, okay, well, let's continue this thought. Let's make a little QRP dummy load. Let's make an antenna relay board. Let's make some other stuff. So we've continued this theme basically to do two things. One is to provide some kind of little gadgetry that's useful for people. Some of them are common, like a dummy load, and some not so common, like a dummy load with an Arduino, so you can measure the wattage. So that's a little bit of a twist. But the other reason, really the main reason, is just to get people to build stuff. And I find a lot of people want to build something, but they don't know what. So they know they've got the itch to build projects, and sometimes they just need someone to say, here, build this, and they'll go build it. So that's worked out really well. And frankly, as a quote business unquote, selling circuit boards is a real pain in the neck, and I don't recommend it to anybody unless you have an ulterior motive. And our ulterior motive was to incite people to build.
Well, I think also the advantage is that ham radio operators are very good parallel players. I recall growing up and listening to 9.4 in Los Angeles or 4.6 in Los Angeles, and half a dozen hams would be sitting at their workbenches at night building something and commenting every once in a while or talking about what they're building, or maybe they're building the same thing. So you've kind of created this atmosphere of parallel play. So you have these people all working together to build the antenna analyzer and then giving you feedback maybe on Facebook or
oh, yes.
somehow, so that you actually, they all kind of felt they were part of something bigger.
Exactly. And there's kind of several layers to that. So on one level, we want to encourage people to build something. And if you want to build something that's not one of these boards, great, go build that, whatever that is, just build something. The second thing is, when you have a community that's building the same thing, then you have that opportunity for exchange and for improvement. So we see, like on our Facebook page or through emails, we see all kinds of comments, some of which are like, okay, I built it, but it doesn't work. What did I do wrong? And someone else jumps in and says, well, did you do this? Oh, no, I didn't know. So then they go do that and it works. And then other people build it and then come back and say, this is all fine, but it would be better if the software did something else. So I've enhanced the software, and now you can download my new version. So you get at one end of the builder spectrum, you get people who are learning just to do assembly, let alone create something new. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got people who are taking your base thing and then doing a derivative on that, and then making it even better for the community. And that's when you've got something, when you can kind of sit back and watch it kind of operate on its own momentum, and that's really what we're shooting for.
Well, I have to tell you again, I'm the big fan of the podcast, and I've never missed an episode. But I'm awestruck in that, in addition to your professional career and a busy schedule, that you have the time to continually innovate, build, and share. Do you have a secret that you could share with us about time management and how you get it all done?
Insomnia.
I was hoping you wouldn't say that.
Well, between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. is a waste of time, so you might as well be designing a circuit board. No, seriously. I mean, things. You find time to some extent. So our kids are grown and out of the house, so that helps. So when you've got little kids, you're completely absorbed with your kids and your job, and you don't really have much time. And so 15, 20 years ago, I wouldn't have time to do this, but both of my kids are adult kids and they're out of the house, and so that does create some extra time. But in my job, for example, if I'm on a business trip, I've got airplane time, and certainly on the airplane you could do some work, but a lot of stuff you really can't do on the airplane because it's confidential or whatever. So you find time here and there. I'm not a big sit around and watch TV guy. The only time I ever watch TV is if it's some particular show that I really, really want to watch. But that's fairly rare. Most of the evening time is, if it's time by myself, it's going to be working on some ham radio project. I do very little operating, which is kind of a shame. I would like to do more operating, but I probably spent 90% of my ham radio time building something as opposed to using it, which is kind of weird. But that's the part of it that I enjoy, is the designing and the building. And quite frankly, I think if you're like a DIY builder type person, you always have in the back of your mind an idea for something, whether it's a mechanical thing or an electronic circuit or just how to hook stuff up you've already got. There's always that, the essential maker kind of mentality of, I can always build another thing. So it's kind of hard to shut that off, frankly.
So I have an idea for
What's
a project. That? For those of us who remember the Motorola MyCore mobiles and the repeaters in the 1970s, it had a unique chip in the squelch circuit that removed the squelch tail at the end of the transmission.
Mm-hmm.
I see the chip occasionally available only on surplus. You can't buy it new anymore from Motorola. Why can't we do this now with silicon? And could we build a tone decoder MyCore squelch circuit in a little board that could be added on to, our repeater project or our All-Star project or one of the projects like that, VHF, UHF?
Oh yeah, you're describing project number 25 in my head. so
where are we at?
Yes.
What number are we at now, George? Are we at 12?
4,706. So that's a great project, and actually, quite seriously, one that I've wanted to do for some time. That Motorola squelch chip, I actually have a couple of rails of those things. I've got about 100 of them.
Do you really?
Yeah, and the reason I've got, so it's a little digression. So the repeater controllers that we build don't have squelch built into them. They assume the squelch is in the radio, and some radios have a decent squelch and some don't. And those Motorola squelch chips were really very good. And so I have a friend who had been sitting on a whole bunch of them for many years, and so I bought them off of him. And the reason is that I was going to make a little daughter card that you could put that squelch chip on in the next generation of repeater controller that we're designing. You have the ability to add little daughter cards to do audio processing. But anyway, the problem is, as you say, Eric, those chips have been out of production for 20 years, and there's just no predictable source for those things. And so couldn't you do the same thing in software? And of course the answer is yes, absolutely. And why nobody's really done a very good one, it kind of surprises me. And the guy who I designed the repeater controller with, John KJ6K, who is absolutely brilliant, he and I were talking about this several years ago, and we were thinking about how to actually do it. It doesn't take a whole lot. I mean, all you really need is an analog to digital converter and then a processor that could run fast enough to be able to take the sample, look at the signal to noise, and take multiple samples and be able to do some math on a kind of a sequence of samples. So you don't want to look at the instantaneous value and make a decision. You kind of want to look at the last 50 samples or whatever, and then decide what to do about it. And you could actually make a squelch chip that's better than the MyCore squelch chip. The MyCore squelch chip was kind of a two-state device. In other words, it would operate in kind of a tight squelch or loose squelch state. And once you went into the noise, it would track you down into the noise. And I think you could do that, or maybe even better, with signal processing. So we looked at doing it and figured out that there's enough what's called multiply, accumulate executable commands in some of the DSPIC microchip parts that you can make a reasonably good squelch out of those chips with an ADC. Another friend of mine who's a DSP expert, I mean, that's what he does for a living. We talked about it, and he said he would do it in an FPGA because you can just implement the algorithm and do it in logic, and that it would just be super fast. So it's totally doable. It's just a matter of having it bubble up to the top of the project list and kind of getting to it. But when we started looking at doing it in an FPGA, actually that kind of spawned a greater project, which was, well, why don't you do everything you want to do in audio signal processing for repeater? So you can do PL detection, you could do PL generation, which is easy. You could do a high pass filter, so you can eliminate the PL tone. You could do pre-emphasis and de-emphasis. You could do DTMF decoding, and all of those things in an FPGA can be done essentially in parallel because you have a huge array of logic. And so once you get past the ADC, then that data can be fed into multiple pipes of data of logic, and you could do all that stuff literally in parallel in real time. But of course, like a lot of projects, sounded great on a napkin and never turned into a real project, but maybe someday.
Well, I saw that I heard you were building a project like an all-star node. For those of the listeners that haven't heard me rail on about all-star is amateur radio linking over the internet using the Asterisk phone system as the core technology. But you were talking about a project that you were building, and it seems to me that maybe that little board that had two transmitters on it might be the right place to start with something like this.
It certainly could. That was another build project. So the idea there was to make a really simple repeater controller, and that repeater controller could be used either as a single port or dual port analog repeater controller, or you can have a radio on one side and All-Star on the other side on a Raspberry Pi. So I built all that stuff up and started to write the firmware, and just got swamped with other projects. And so that one's sort of been put to the back burner. There just is not enough time in the day. So I'll pick that one up eventually. The idea of doing the micro squelch project was really to enhance our big repeater controllers that we build. So we were talking about Alan, WA6AWD, and his Cactus controller. And there's a whole thread there that eventually another fella picked up Alan's sort of architectural concept and implemented a commercial repeater controller. A fellow named Rick, WB6VTM, who had a company called Palomar Telecom. And so he made a Cactus-compatible repeater controller with a Z80 processor and a bunch of boards. And then eventually he stopped production of that. And then about 2005 or so, John and I decided to build our own Cactus-compatible controller, which has subsequently become the standard repeater controller for Cactus and a bunch of other systems. So that was the target for doing this micro squelch thing. So it was not the baby controller so much as the big controller.
Your company, is that Sierra Radio Systems then?
Yes.
Okay. Because I was going to ask you, I saw that there's a product called the Ham Stack. Is that your repeater controller?
No. So the first project that John and I worked on was the repeater controller, and that was an enormous project. I mean, this is one of those things where when you're done with the first version and it works, you kind of look back and think, man, had I known then what I know now, I probably wouldn't have tried doing this. But we made it, and it worked. So that was great, and it was a tremendous learning experience. So we finally got to the first major release of the repeater controller and have made enhancements since then. But around that time, we had a lot of people who were asking us, well, how'd you do it? And this is back 10 years ago, before everybody knew what an Arduino was and a Raspberry Pi. So we had a lot of questions. Hey, I want to build a thing like this or like that. And, how did you do your repeater controller? And, how should I build my gadget? And so we would point them in the direction of use this part, use this compiler, or whatever. And we decided that it would be kind of fun to put out some development boards and project kits for people to learn how to design and build microcontroller-based stuff. So we made a product line called the Ham Stack. And the reason why it's called the Ham Stack, well, ham's obvious, right? The stack part is that we took the idea of the Arduino Uno's footprint, where you could plug in what they call a shield, a little daughter card on top of it, and thought, okay, well, that's a good idea, but we didn't really like the Arduino platform when it first came out, so we used a PIC, and we had a whole bunch of boards that would stack together, and you could design your own project. So we had that for about 5 years and wrote a book about how to design and program and all that. And eventually, as the Raspberry Pis and Arduinos really matured and really became useful, then we decided there's no point in doing our own thing, so we stopped that. So that's that. Ultimately, the Hamstack thing was two things. One, it was a set of development boards, and then we ultimately did make a few completed products. Like we did one of my all-time favorite projects I've ever worked on. We called a radio router. That's essentially a multi-port receive transmit switching device, so you can have multiple radios in your shack and switch between different radios and different antennas and headsets and stuff like that. So we did try making a few finished products. The problem is that you do this in hobby time, so you really don't have time to adequately sell it and promote it and all that. And so we just decided that it was not worth our time to continue with those things, so we stopped doing that.
So Sierra Radio Systems no longer sells repeater control systems?
No, so Sierra Radio still exists, but in its primary product is the repeater control system. So we still do that, but it's kind of, repeater controllers are a weird business because individuals generally don't buy them. Clubs tend to buy them, and it tends to be a long, protracted decision. And, you buy it and then you use it for 20 years. And so it's a weird kind of sales cycle. And we don't advertise, we don't promote it, we don't talk it up anywhere. It's all word of mouth. And so what happens essentially is we at no point did we ever say, hey, let's make a ham radio business. I mean, that's if you want to lose money in a quick way, then start a ham radio company. Take your hobby and turn it into a business and do it part-time is a great way to just waste a lot of money. But the reason that we did it was when Rick's repeater controllers went out of production, they were unavailable for like 10 years. And, the old repeater controllers were very reliable and they work great and there's no problems with them. But eventually there was a pressure building up that, they wanted to put more sites. This is the Cactus Intertie. They needed more repeater controllers because there's more sites going up somewhere. And so at the same time, we were working on ours, and not to create a commercial product, but just because we wanted to build one. So we ultimately got to the point where ours was good enough for Cactus to use it, and so they bought a bunch. And then they, people would always ask them, well, hey, you do this in a big way. What do you use? And they say, well, we use these Sierra repeater controllers. So then people out of the blue would come to us and say, hey, we want a controller. And so we wound up in a situation where we would get requests for controllers, and so we would go off and build a batch, and we would build more than people are asking for, so we would have inventory. But you'd get an email out of the blue, some guy wants a repeater controller in the middle of Kansas. Well, okay. And so we would sell them a repeater controller. But, how they found us was always a mystery because we never advertised. We never promoted it. So Sierra Radio still exists, and we do still make repeater controllers, but it's really a boutique hobby business. And we think we make the best one out there. And certainly if you're doing linking, it's probably the best, most reliable, and certainly most modular and expandable system. And we're actually in the midst of doing a Gen 3 design right now. The design's done. We've actually prototyped the first set of physical boards, and we're now about to assemble the second rev of the prototype, and hopefully it's the last one. So the new generation has it's all backward compatible with the previous generation, plus it's got some cool new features.
Like an all-star link port, maybe?
Well, that's trivial. I mean, you could take the existing controller and plug in an all-star node right now, and it would just work because in the firmware, we can assign a personality to every port. So the controller is 1 to 8 ports, and every port can be any kind of personality that we provide. So a repeater is a personality, an RF link, a remote base, a simplex link, a full duplex link, etc. So a VoIP port like All-Star is one of the personality types. And so we support All-Star and Echolink and IRLP and all that stuff.
Well, I can't wait.
So that's just plugging a node into it. Yeah, it's actually that works now, even on the old generation stuff. So by the way, what's the difference? The difference between a VoIP port, let's say, and a link port is that in a link port, we're assuming that the link is part of your private radio network. And so if you put in DTMF control codes into your repeater, it sends those tones down the link. Well, in a VoIP connection, most of the time that's a public connection. Most of the time that's not a private point-to-point connection, in which case you want to mute the tones and not have them go out through that port. You want to not send CWID out that port, for instance. So there's a bunch of parameters about how a port behaves, and a certain set of those parameters dictate the personality. So anyway, IRLP, Echolink, all that stuff.
What's your favorite microcontroller for projects now?
It's a split decision. There's 4 that I use a lot. 2 that are traditional microcontrollers, which is a PIC and an Arduino, of course. And then for Linux-based projects, the Raspberry Pi and the BeagleBone. And I use all 4 very regularly. So I've used PICs a lot because they're very reliable, and there's some excellent compilers available for them. The Atmel Arduino and other Arduino-based tools are getting so much better that I think if you had to pick one, for sure, I would go down the Arduino path, not because of the hardware so much as because of the software libraries that are available for it. There's a library for virtually every kind of peripheral chip you can imagine these days. So it just makes it so much easier to do a project with an Arduino. But our repeater controller is all based on PICs. And most of the work I've done in the past are based on PICs, and they're just super reliable. But of course, the Linux stuff is also popular. So Raspberries,
right? BeagleBone,
and actually we use BeagleBones as an accessory in our fancy repeater controller. It's a 3U rack, and there's extra slots, and we have a host adapter that lets you plug a BeagleBone onto it and plug into the backplane, and we use that for our voice telemetry and streaming telemetry. So you can send the state of your repeater controller over the internet, and that's all accomplished with a BeagleBone. And the BeagleBones are great because they're real industrial grade processors that are on there, so they're quite reliable.
You're just shy of 38,000 lookups on QRZ. Why no entry on your QRZ page?
That's a great question. I should put something on there.
Somebody's looking, weird. George.
Yeah,
somebody's looking.
Yeah. You'd think of someone who does a podcast, I would be kind of a social media guy, but I'm not. I tend to have as small a social media footprint as I can. So I don't do Facebook except for our Facebook podcast site. I don't do a lot of that sort of stuff, and so I just don't put my stuff out there on QRZ, although I probably should. That's probably a good reminder.
Is KJ6VU a vanity call sign?
No, it's not. It was a random call sign. When I upgraded from general to advanced, that was the call sign that I was issued. And in retrospect, I really liked it. I thought, wow, that out of 3, that was the first call sign that was any good. So I kept it. When I got my extra, I just kept the call.
What's your favorite digital mode on HF?
CW.
Well, that's easy.
No, really. CW would be my favorite mode if I would, sort of define it broadly. But keyboard to keyboard, honestly, I'm not a big digital mode guy yet. I've done PSK, and I enjoyed that a lot. I find the JT slow modes painful, and I think they're fascinating, and I think they're wonderful, but I don't find them pleasurable. So I'm interested in playing around with I'm going to say JT8 call, but I think it's now called something else. In fact, we're going to have Jordan, who's the author of that, on the podcast in the next month or so.
Oh, sounds good.
And I want to learn about that. Yeah, because the signal to noise performance of that mode is unbelievably good. And if it's a live typable keyboard kind of communication, I think it'd be really fun. I don't really care for these very long, like, here's my 6 characters and it took me 5 minutes to transmit it. I find that just boring. It's technically fascinating, and more power to them for doing it, but I just don't find that pleasurable.
What's your favorite digital mode on VHF and UHF?
Oh, for voice?
Yes.
Yeah, I can get into hot water here. I would have to say at the moment DMR. I have to say that, don't I?
No, I don't think so. I see you're a D-Star expert from the way it looks to me when I'm looking at the presentations you've made over the years.
Well, so I guess things have sort of evolved. So I first got into D-Star about 7-8 years ago. A friend of mine, Rich, KC6OBJ, called me up and said, I got to come show you something. He came over with a little netbook, if you remember netbooks at the time, and a little DV dongle, little USB transceiver module, and a handy talkie. So he plugged it in, turned it on, and we were chatting with somebody in Europe on his handy talkie going through the computer. And when I saw that, I thought, wow, that's really cool, because I can take my network with me. And so I got into D-Star kind of in a big way, and we put up a D-Star repeater, and we were like the new kid on the block, and now our D-Star repeater is like the main one in Silicon Valley, so it's kind of funny how things change. So we've been running that for several years. About 3 or 4 years ago, when Fusion came out, we got a Fusion repeater and installed that, and then about a year ago, we put in a DMR repeater. So our club runs all 3. Quite frankly, my advice to anybody who says, well, what digital mode should I use? My advice is to pick the one that your friends are already using. So in a way, especially for a new user, there's not that much of a difference. So you might as well go where the people are that you want to talk to. So that would be my first piece of advice.
I find that DMR can be a very lonely place if everyone's asleep when you're driving around.
Yes, I imagine that's true. So I really like D-Star a ton. We have our repeater sitting on 1C, which is one of the big international reflectors out of the UK. That's a lot of fun. I have spent almost no time on Fusion, so I have not much to say about operating it. And I spend a lot of time on DMR because I think DMR will probably be the one that is the most popular over time. It's very reliable. The equipment is really good. I must say that the from a repeater owner's perspective, the DMR system is hands down better than D-Star and Fusion for a bunch of reasons. So I think
it's a lot less work, I think, frankly.
It's less work. It's physically smaller. It's more reliable hardware. It's better performing hardware. It's more reliable protocol. You can kind of go down the list. There really is no downside to it. I mean, frankly, if you kind of go back 3 or 4 years ago, when I first looked at DMR, I kind of rejected it because the way DMR worked 4 years ago was very restrictive. So you can only talk to a specific set of talk groups that you predefined on your repeater, no hotspots, to kind of go down the list. All the things that are really cool about D-Star were like, don't do it on DMR. And I thought, well, okay, then forget that. So now what's happened is typical in ham radio is a lot of smart people figured out, well, we could implement all that stuff. We don't have to wait for someone else to do it. We'll just do it ourselves. So now you've got networks that allow you to connect to any talk group. There's a proliferation of talk groups to connect to. It supports hotspots. You can build your own repeat. You can do like whatever you want to do with DMR now. And so I think because of that, it's become a much more attractive mode. The only kind of last hurdle to be overcome is the user's experience with the radio is still cumbersome because it's very much a commercial radio user model where everything is channelized and it's all programmed through the computer. Very few radios have front panel programming. So I think the last kind of shoe to drop is going to be when one of the big ham radio companies like ICOM, Yaesu, Kenwood, etc., come out with their radio that also has DMR in it. but is a normal amateur radio, and I think they'll be wildly successful. And I think it's a big miss that none of them have done that so far, because I think they all have this mindset of, I'm ICOM and I'm D-Star, I'm Yaesu, I'm Fusion, and not open to going to the other modes, which is really a big mistake in my opinion. But
well, I think the hams are also going to push back. I think most hams don't like proprietary formats. The brand-related proprietary formats.
Yes, but frankly, there's a bit of a misunderstanding about that. The only mode that is truly proprietary is the Yaesu Fusion mode, because the D-Star is a JARL standard, and anybody can make a D-Star radio. You don't have to be ICOM. Anybody can make a DMR radio. You don't have to be Motorola or Hytera. And only Yaesu can make a Fusion radio, which they may or may not open that up someday. So yeah, that's true. But I think there's no reason, like ICOM could put DMR in their radios and et cetera. There's no reason they can't do that
without major hardware changes. Maybe no hardware changes.
Well, all you need is another codec and some UI firmware. I mean, it's not that big a deal, quite frankly. And I think their problem, if I'm ICOM Yaesu, if I'm these guys, my concern is I would like to sell you a $400 radio, and my competition is selling a $100 DMR radio. So how in the world am I going to compete with that?
Yeah, that's pretty
If the
hard.
market starts to move to DMR, I'm in deep trouble. So what you've seen is price pressure bringing Yaesu and ICOM radios down in price. Not that cheap, but still down in price. But eventually, I think they're either going to have to adopt multiple digital modes, or whoever's the first one to do it is going to really gain a significant market share.
Although I think there's still a lot of room for dual band mobile radio that does analog and DMR and D-Star or all together, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that that should be in mobiles and in handhelds as well. There's no reason not to.
What do you think the greatest challenge is to ham radio now?
I think it's the age-old challenge of recruiting new hams and getting them active. You see the numbers are very healthy, and that's great. I think there's a lot of people that get their license and don't do anything with it. And I think the challenge is encouraging people. There's a lot of effort to get people licensed, but there's not a lot of work that goes in after that to get them active. And that's really where the learning starts, and that's really where the building that real deep connection to amateur radio begins. It's not getting the license; it's what you do with it once you got it. So I think the biggest challenge is getting people active, and regardless of what they're interested in, any mode or any activity is great. Just do it.
What excites you the most about what's happening in ham radio now?
Let me give you a couple of quick answers. The first quick answer is kind of an odd one, which is the internet. Because when the internet was becoming more and more popular, everybody thought, oh my gosh, this is going to, cell phones and the internet will doom amateur radio. But I think the internet has been the biggest shot in the arm to amateur radio, because if it wasn't for the internet, we would not be doing podcasts. If it wasn't for the internet, there would not be linked digital UHF, VHF repeater systems. If it wasn't for the internet, you wouldn't be doing Logbook of the World and all that stuff. So I think that's been just a phenomenal kick in the pants. The proliferation of modes, I think, is phenomenal. The number of digital modes, HF digital modes versus VHF digital modes, the caliber of small portable radios. I mean, I can go on and on. I think there's just an amazing number of very cool things these days that are just accelerating ham radio. One thing I love is that a lot of people are interested in mixing activities like outdoor operating is great. Getting outdoors and playing radio. 30 years ago, you could do it on field day, but it wasn't that easy. And now with these tiny little radios, you can just toss a radio in your backpack and go to the park, climb a hill, and get on the radio. And if you live in an apartment and you have no way to do HF, you can certainly do that. So there's just so many things that are enabling the operation of radio today. It's incredible.
What advice would you give to new or returning hams then?
I think I would encourage them to get exposure to as many different kinds of amateur radio activity as you can, and then figure out what you really want to do and dive into it. And know full well that whatever you pick now, a year from now, you might be into something different. So, don't get locked into one thing. The worst thing in the world is you get your license, and like you said before, you get your handy-talkie and declare victory, and now I'm a ham. And that's fine, but don't stop there. Go to field day, get on the air, get on HF, try, learn CW, try digital modes, build something, just try a bunch of different things. So I think that's what I would do. And to help get there, find a community. So in the old days, the community was your local radio club, and it still is for a lot of people. Like we were saying, the internet provides a whole nother layer of community where you can find people interested in the stuff you're interested in, but you got to kind of reach out and make contact with people and, ask them questions and learn how stuff works. So, I think it's just try to expose yourself to as many things as you can.
And George, if people wanted to find you, how would they do that?
Best way is by email. So you can email KJ6VU at hamradioworkbench.com. Or I do have a Twitter account that I post to very rarely, but occasionally at KJ6VU. And also on the Ham Radio Workbench Facebook page. I'm fairly active there. So you could just join that group and find hundreds and hundreds of other guys who like to build and show people their projects and ask questions and learn stuff.
Right, and you can also find the Ham Radio Workbench podcast at hamradioworkbench.com. George, I know I've only touched the edge of the iceberg here with you, but we're going to have to leave it here, and I'm just going to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast and wish you 73.
Thank you so much, Eric. I really appreciate it, and we'll talk to you soon. 73s.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with George. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in KJ6VU in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages, or when you make your purchases, that you say that you heard it here on QSO Today. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the other episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference. QSO Today is now available on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Libsyn, and TuneIn, as well as the iTunes Store. If you own an Amazon Echo, you can say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." I still use Stitcher to listen to podcasts on my smartphone. The links to all of these services are on the show notes pages on the right side. Until next time, this is Eric 4Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.